do Q&A from there.
Awesome. Got it.
Cool.
I'll mute myself now.
All right. Thanks for your help. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We're all technologists. We can figure this out, right? All right. Thanks, everybody. Okay. So my name is Mike Pfeiffer, Microsoft Azure MVP. Been doing IT work since 98. Can't wait to retire. No, I'm just kidding. No, actually, I'm still enjoying it. And this time in our industry is really interesting. Before we had to switch meetings, I was talking about this presentation is aimed squarely at complete beginners to infrastructure as code. I'm going to do some demos. I'm going to do some Q&A at the end. And my hope in this talk is just to hopefully get you started and go down the road of infrastructure as code. Aimed at absolute beginners. We don't have time to go, super in depth. But I think that we can answer a lot of questions along the way, and that's what we're going to do. So number one, super pumped to be here. My focus on this one is going to be high level, and remember the patterns are in the important piece of this, okay? Because we could use ARM templates, we could use Terraform. Even some of the stuff I'll talk about would apply at AWS from a high level, okay? But I'm really going to focus on a few things. Number one, basic Git workflow. How would you create a repo in GitHub? How would you get an infrastructure template in there? And then how would you navigate launching that to build your infrastructure? Because the cool thing is, yeah, we can write templates and do all this automation, but ultimately getting it in version control is, a core concept. Okay, so a lot of us are new to that. I'm going to show that. I'm here on github.com. I'm going to put a repository in here live. I'll create it and I'll leave it up here. So if you want to go back and grab it later, it'll be in there. And, just think about your questions along the way. I'm going to drop a lot of just my own thoughts and stuff about different things. I'll point out a bunch of stuff. And then when we get to the end, I'll try to answer as many questions as I can. Okay. So what I'm going to do here, there's a million ways that we could attempt to tackle this, but I'm going to use ARM templates for this conversation. All right. And then I'll be talking about other platforms and tools and stuff as we go. I think that ARM templates have gotten a little bit of a bad rep just because of the verbosity of the JSON templates. Microsoft's working on fixing that. You may have seen Azure Bicep out there. I'll talk about that. If you haven't heard about it, no worries. We'll get into it. But when I was at AWS, so let me back up. In 2012, I was working at Microsoft, and then I was like, maybe I should go to Azure team. Seems like everything's going cloud, started looking at jobs in Azure to make a lateral move, and then ended up getting an opportunity at AWS. So I jumped over to AWS, and I was a solutions architect on a brand new team. It was called the AWS Quick Start team. And they had some success building infrastructure templates and coupling that with a white paper and giving it to customers. And then it was so successful, they're like, let's build a whole team on this. So I was the first cloud solution architect on that team. I built a bunch of stuff over the couple of years that I was there, and Microsoft even ended up building their own quick start team to do templates, which was pretty fun. But I love this stuff. I've been doing this a long time. When I left Amazon, I was helping customers on the Amazon Web Services platform do infrastructure as code and DevOps. I went back into Azure and started doing tons of Azure stuff, and I've been doing almost nothing but Azure for the last about year and a half. So anyways, that's kind of my backstory. All right. And so let's go ahead and just jump into it. What I'm going to do here is, number one, I'm going to start by building a repository in GitHub. This is where we're going to live or store our code. There's lots of cool ways to where we can take the code in a repository and then just automatically spin it up based on all kinds of different things that might happen. And so we don't really have time to get into CI/CD for infrastructure templates and stuff. But let's start simple. Okay, I'm going to create a new repository here. Also, the reason I'm doing this as a beginner thing is so hopefully somebody can watch this video and follow along later, stuff like that. But I'm going to call this one IAC demo for infrastructure as code demo. I'll make it a public repository, and then I'll add a README, a markdown file that will be included. We can do some documentation. If I wanted to ignore files, right, I could do a git ignore. That thing will basically be a little file where I can go in there and say, hey, ignore things that shouldn't belong in the directory. For now, I'm just going to leave that empty. We can also choose a license here to make this an open source project. So let's just pick the MIT license, create an empty repository. Now, there's a ton of different Git tools and extensions, right? So I'm a big fan of Visual Studio Code. So I do all my infrastructure development, code.visualstudio.com. Just to kind of show this, I'm pretty sure that this thing's got enough brand recognition where you guys have heard of it. Why is this not cooperating? Visualstudio.com, code.visualstudio.com. So anyways, I use this thing like crazy, not only for infrastructure development, but I also do a fair amount of ASP.NET Core web development, not a ton, but I am a little bit of a geek when it comes to web development. So I use this thing constantly. There's amazing extensions for pretty much just about anything that you can think of. So that's what I'll be using here. But anyways, there are Git extensions just built into it. So all the work that I'm going to do in Git and GitHub and stuff, you can do this from your IDE and Visual Studio Code, but I want to make sure it's clear, like what is really happening when you're doing certain things, right? So first of all, we've got an empty repository. Let me grab the clone URL for this. And then what I'm going to do here is bring up a terminal on my machine. Don't worry if you're not on Mac, doesn't matter. What I'm going to do here is in an empty folder on my computer, I've got Git already installed, right? So I'm going to do a Git clone on that brand new repository. There was 10 ways that I could have built that, right? But this is what we're going to do. We're going to switch into that folder. This is a initialized Git repo. We just cloned it, right? So if I do a Git status, like, hey, there's a master branch in here, and you don't really have anything in there. So if you want to start working, we're going to add files to this folder. We're going to have to commit our changes, stage our changes, commit them, and then eventually push them back up into GitHub, right? And this is something you want to get used to doing as an infrastructure developer. It might seem off topic, might not, because people are talking about it like crazy. But, I just came from earlier this year working with a customer who was completely all in on Azure, and their entire workflow for managing their infrastructure was through code. So if you wanted to change something, even as minuscule as, a inbound security rule on like an NSG, that would have to be a change in a template that would kick off a whole CI/CD process, workflow with pull requests and checks and all kinds of stuff. So I would envision lots of enterprises are going to move into that process, right? So let me open up this folder in Visual Studio Code. Start off with a little mini project here, okay? I do need to update some of the software on this machine.
Mike,
right, so
for some of your screens, sometimes could you make the font bigger? The Git was fine, but sometimes the writing is small.
Sure thing. Yeah, I'll do that. And so let's take a look at this, and then we'll see what happens here. So in this folder, right, we got an empty workspace open here in Visual Studio Code. What I'm going to do in this repository, I'm going to create a new file, Azure deploy.json. I'm going to be using the native ARM templating system available in Azure. So again, yeah, Terraform is great. We got YouTube channels on we got YouTube videos on our channel that show you how to get started with Terraform. I can share those at the end of the talk. But one of the things that's underestimated about ARM templates is, number one, they plug into tons of stuff. If you're working for an ISV, or you end up working with an ISV and you got to build marketplace solutions, they're going to show up in Azure, or you're just building like reusable solutions for people inside your own organization. There's a ton of Azure integrations where knowing ARM templates in the system is really beneficial. Same thing when it comes to like Azure Blueprints. If you haven't heard of Azure Blueprints, it's basically a way for you to do well-architected and secured deployments, right? So a blueprint can spin up an ARM template. It can, help you implement the right Azure policy for the infrastructure you deploy. And it also includes like the RBAC role assignments. So it's like everything you need. And if you don't understand the ARM templating system, it's going to be really difficult to understand blueprints. It's going to be hard to understand even kind of what's going on with Azure policy. At the end of the day, all of this stuff isn't expressed in JSON format. All right, so what I'm going to do here is just show that, but the patterns and the practices will be very similar. So we got an empty JSON template here, right? Now, a couple things. Number one, in Visual Studio Code, I've got a bunch of extensions installed. So first up, let me show you this guy here, Azure account. So, install Visual Studio Code, go to this little icon, search for the extensions, install Azure account. This will let you sign into Azure from Visual Studio Code. It'll let you open a Cloud Shell in Visual Studio Code. It's pretty slick, okay? So we're going to need that. The other one that I'm using in here is the ARM tools, right? This is from Microsoft. It's got snippets. It's an easy way to get started, okay? So these two are installed. First, before I do anything though, let's talk about JSON. Not everybody's a developer. And hopefully this font size is good for you. You just holler at me if it isn't. But let me first just do a quick primer, like in 2 minutes on JSON, okay? And this will be probably something useful if you've done PowerShell and are kind of familiar with the object-oriented nature of PowerShell. But what we want to do with an ARM template, essentially, JSON is just key value pairs. So when developers are representing something as a JSON object, it's just a collection of key value pairs, properties, and their values. So for example, in an application, I might be passing around a data payload that represents a user in JSON format. It doesn't have to be, all my Azure resources, right? So for example, might have an object of a person, right? And the person would have, well, maybe a first name, I should say, first name, right? And then that first name would be something like Mike, right? So that would be an object with a single property. But if you're adding multiple properties, right, you have a comma, you have something like this, another property, last name. So keys and values, when it's just strings, right, are enclosed in double quotes. Now properties can also be can correspond to integers. So like age, 27, not really that young anymore. Let's go real, 44, proud of it, 45 in December. So notice when I'm putting a number, it's actually not in double quotes. That tells JSON or whatever consumes this data, oh, that's an integer, not a string. We can also have properties that are equal to another object. So for example, we might have favorite, let's see if I can type here, favorite colors, right? And that corresponds to an array of colors that are my favorite, right? So when you see a value that has multiple results or values, or excuse me, a property that contains multiple values, we enclose them in square brackets just like this. So it have blue, black, whatever, right? And we could even have a property be a complex JSON object, right? So I could have a comma, hit return, do another key, and say like family, right? And then I could have an array of family members, and then I could have a JSON object inside that array for everyone, right? Inside the square, or excuse me, curly braces, tongue twister. Inside here, again, key value pairs. So first name, right? You know what I mean? So that's kind of the big idea with JSON. The reason I'm showing this is because I think most of us crack open an ARM template and there's like 10,000 lines of JSON and it's like, whoa, get me out of here. But the truth is, if you start small, very small, then it's very simple. All right, so let me break it down for you. Let me delete this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to use that ARM tools extension. One of the things that allows you to do is use this keyword ARM to stub out a blank template. All right, so watch, I just typed ARM there, I hit tab, and this gives us the structure for a very simple template. And you'll see this in other systems, other infrastructure as code systems, very common. Number one, there's a schema reference to a deployment template from Microsoft that just kind of sets up, what can we do in this template? Content version property where we can version our own template. But really the big stuff that's important is like parameters. You see this in any other infrastructure as code platform. Input parameters so we could do dynamic values at runtime. Now, the templates might be automatically spinning up as part of a CI/CD situation, right? But even then, we want to have a template that can take dynamic information. So just like a PowerShell script could have parameters, right? We can have parameters in a template. There are template functions, but the one thing you got to remember with most of these things, like ARM templates or Terraform and things like that, this is a declarative system, a declarative approach. It's not a programming language, right? It doesn't have all the depths of what you can do with C#, right? It's very simple. It's stating the intent. We're feeding the template into some system and it's processing it, right? But there is some basic template functions, right? So Microsoft's got some template functions that are really useful, like concatenating strings and doing a bunch of stuff like that. There's also the ability to do custom functions. There's a variables block here. Again, you see this in Terraform as well. See this in CloudFormation on the AWS side as well. Variables is just so we're not repeating ourselves, right? If I'm going to have a string that says West US 2, we're going to be always using that region. Well, there's no reason for me to type West US 2 100 times in the template. Just put it in a variable, reference the variable 100 times, right? And if I need to change that value, just change the variable. Also, one thing I'll cover here before resource. So outputs. Outputs are cool because sometimes you want to build something and then spit out the result of whatever you built, right? So for example, if you got an ARM template that spins up an app service web app, you don't know what the URL is until the deployment is complete, right? Unless you're kind of hard coding it in a way, maybe through an input parameter. Or a better example might be you spin up an Azure load balancer. The public IP address is something you would have never known before the template build started, right? So you can pass the output back to the operator, and you can pass that to another template. When you're chaining the templates together, that's a very common practice. And again, this is a framework that you could do in multiple systems. And so that's why I'm just kind of starting with this one. All right, so finally, the last important thing here is resources. Like, what are we actually going to target with this? So inside that array, right, notice it's square brackets. I'm going to hit enter inside my resources block, and they're expecting JSON objects in here, right, to represent my resources in Azure. So I'm just going to type ARM, and I'm going to do one very simple resource so we can focus on what it is we're doing. And there's one for an NSG, a network security group. So if you've been working with Azure, you probably run into this when you're dealing with VMs and stuff. A network security group is just a software firewall. You can connect it to a NIC on a VM. You can associate it with a subnet in an Azure VNet. All that stuff works, but check it out. What's the name? Well, we can hard code this, or we could parameterize it. First, let's just do the hard coding scenario. Web-NSG. So this is going to be a network security group for a web server. But notice it's just an object. It's just a JSON object, right? So when I expand and collapse it, we can just see it's just a collection of key value pairs. I just got to know a little bit about what these are, right? So I'm giving it a name. The type is important. This is how Microsoft's going to know, oh, okay, this guy wants to build a security group. There's an API version that kind of dictates what can we do with this resource. Notice the location property. This is kind of interesting. This is an example of using a function, an ARM template function. See, it's called resource group. And it says right here in the IntelliSense, or in this little context menu, this returns a structured object that represents the current resource group. All right, so when we're doing Azure and doing ARM templates, we're expecting the resource group to be there. Like it either was created right before we're doing the launch of the template, or it was there before. We're not building resource groups from the template, okay? And this is kind of cool though, because this shows the ability for us to call a function. When that function returns a response, we're just catching the location property. So think about it this way. Somebody launches this template, they're launching it into a resource group in West US 2, and then we're able to infer the location by just calling resource group.location. So we put the network security group in the parent resource group, and we're off and running, right? So that's a cool technique. I'll show you a couple other things about how this syntax plays out in a minute. Now, properties for this group, and this is just one resource, right? So I'll show you at the end a full template that does a VM and bootstraps the VM and all that. It can get pretty verbose. So even with just one resource, we're already at 34 lines here. But anyways, the property of a security group would be a set of security rules, right? So since this is a web NSG, I'm going to call this HTTP. We're going to say allow access to TCP port 80 from the internet. Okay, and so right here, protocol is already TCP. Source port range, who cares about the source? They're just coming from the internet. This is a web server. Destination port, we'll say 80. In real life, 443 was something we need to do. We'll fix that later. Source address prefix, again, star, who cares? This is an anonymous web app. Anybody can come, right? And then destination prefix, we don't really care because we're going to hook the network security group to like a NIC or a subnet or whatever. So we'll know where that's going. That's good. Then we're going to allow it, and that looks good, right? Direction inbound. So very simple, right? Let's save this. And let's go back to our Git workflow. So let me jump over to the terminal. I could have done this Git work right there in Visual Studio Code. But again, I think this is a little bit cleaner to see. So watch, Git status. So I've made a change. I created a file, I created an ARM template, put some code in there. And so now in this local repo, they're like, hey, you've got untracked changes. Do you want to like track those and then eventually commit and push that back to GitHub? Yes, I do. And they actually tell you right here, do a git add to track your changes. So I could say git add space Azure deploy.json for the screen. Another thing I could do is just git add period, meaning I might have modified like 10 files in that last run. So let me just stage all those changes. Git status, everything's cool, right? Your changes to be committed is just the new file. So we track the change. Now we need to do a commit to the local repository. That's here on my file system in this folder. So just do a git commit -m and say, initial commit. And I'm not going to type it all out. You get the idea. Probably a good idea to do really descriptive commit messages. You've probably heard that guidance. I'm taking a page from my dad's advice where he used to say, do as I say, not as I do. So I didn't really follow that guidance there, but that's okay. So we got our change committed to the local repo. Let's clear it. And then let's do a git push. Let me show you this first. Git -v, -v, or git, thought it was v. Oh, you know what? I'm having a meltdown here. Here's what it is. Git branch. Let me show you this first. So master, right? One of the things we normally do in real life, right? We'll have multiple branches. And then what we'll do is usually create something other than master. So I've been working on master. And generally, you're never committing code or pushing code to master usually. Usually what you're doing is you're creating a new branch, making your code changes to that, and then pushing the branch and then filing a pull request. Okay. I don't have time to get into all that today. But basically, the remote location for this master branch is GitHub. So if I just do a git push, the local repo changes are going to go up to GitHub. Okay. So real life, you want to think about, as an infrastructure developer, you want to start thinking about the pull request workflow, even though I don't have time to get into that today. It's well documented out there. So watch on GitHub when I do a refresh, there's my little JSON template, right? And so at this point, what I could do is I could spin up like, Azure PowerShell on my machine or Azure CLI. I could deploy this template. Also, now that it's in this repository, I could use something like Azure DevOps to essentially, create a build and release pipeline for even just this simple repository. So anytime I make changes to this and push it to this this repository, I could have a pipeline kickoff that maybe would test the code, maybe lint it, right? A JSON linter to make sure I didn't miss any closing square brackets or closing quotes or any of that stuff. And then once all that checks out, then go deploy the infrastructure. And then once the infrastructure's up, push an app to that infrastructure, right? That's the kind of stuff we do in the AZ400 course at cloudskills.io. It's pretty in-depth. It's cool. Anyways, what I'm going to do here, though, is I don't have any of those tools installed on this machine. Like literally I have nothing. So I'm going to use the Cloud Shell to deploy this template for you so you can see how that's done. So let's jump over to Cloud Shell. If you haven't seen this, you can just go to shell.azure.com and you'll get a full screen Cloud Shell instance. See what I got on the file system in my Cloud Shell. I'm going to do this. I'm just going to clone the repository. We have a Git client in the Cloud Shell. So it's kind of a roundabout way of doing it. This is also might be useful for you later. Let me clone that. And then we'll CD into $home. Inside $home, we'll see IAC demo, right? So we'll switch into IAC demo, clear the screen. And then in here, we see Azure deploy.json. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do what we would do from any CI/CD system, whether it's GitHub Actions, Azure Pipelines, or whatever, is I'm going to create a resource group, and then I'm going to deploy the template into that resource group. So tons of ways to do this, right? But new-az resource group, the name, we're going to call this IAC demo. And then location will be West US 2. So that's step one, get an empty group built, right? Oh, it looks like I had Azure policy set up to tag my stuff, environment production. Very cool. So with that empty group, we're going to deploy our template into it. Okay. And let me clear this. So the command to do that in the PowerShell world these days, new AZ resource group deployment. And then we're going to give the deployment a name, right? So each deployment, there may be many. Remember I was talking about that customer before where it's like, hey, you need to open a security group rule. That's a template change and a new deployment, right? So it was a constant incremental thing. So we want to name the deployment so we can track them. So I'm just going to call it deployment 001. Then we need to fill out the rest of the parameters to tell it like what template to use, what resource group to go in, and so forth, right? So watch, I type template and hit a tab. See how there's like a bunch of parameters? So number one, on the far right, template URI. Maybe the JSON template is just on a web server somewhere, right? And I can just get to it by going to HTTP, whatever the server is / Azure deploy.json. That's one way where I can do a deployment. Template file, that would mean it's on the file system, local to where you're running this command. So that's one option. Template object would be reading the JSON file into memory in a variable and passing that object, that variable, to this command. There's also, you see these other ones here, parameter file, parameter object. So there's a secondary file you can create that will answer or input your parameter values if you have them. So let's keep moving. And what I'll do here, let me, this is hard to read. So let me back out real quick. Let me come down here a little bit and let me show you this. It's getting hard to read there. So let me copy that command and then we'll say template / Azure deploy.json and then resource group name. Do we need to provide a resource group? Yeah, resource group. Tab completion isn't working here. Come on, I'm lazy. Okay, I guess it's not going to do it. Resource group deployment IAC demo. All right, so there we go. Hopefully I didn't fat finger anything. New resource group deployment 001, template file, resource group name. Let's try that. Hit enter. Oh, that's why it wasn't giving me the autocomplete because I screwed up this parameter right here. It should be template file. All right, there we go. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's run it. Now this first time I'm running it, it's going to take a little bit longer than the few subsequent times I'm going to run it later because it's the first time I've ever done it. So by default, Azure resource group deployments like this, template deployments, are incremental. So basically the system is going to look at the template, it's going to look at the resource group, and it's going to take anything in the template that's not in the group and then make it happen. Okay, so check it out. Succeeded, incremental mode, which is the default, everything's cool. So now if I go back into the template and I change like one small thing and do deployment 002, it's just going to update what's already there. There's a different mode as well called complete, I think it's called complete mode, where if it's in the resource group and it's not in the template, it's getting hosed. It's like toasted, right? We're only going to take what's in the template and make that happen in the resource group. That would be complete. And that would be more of a strict, that mode doing complete. That's a more of a strict, like really immutable infrastructure, meaning once you've deployed something, like you never change it again. Like if you rerun the template, you're just, maybe doing a completely new thing if you're making a modification. And that's actually a construct you see in Terraform. All right. But anyways, the default mode here is incremental for ARM templates. So let me show you what we got. Going over to the portal, hitting refresh, we got IAC demo. There's the web NSG, right? So if we drill into this thing, it's got all the stuff that we did, the port 80 rule, right? Everything that we told it to do in the template. So let's take a second look at this. Let's update the template and then run another deployment. All right. And then what I'm going to do here to kind of speed this up, instead of going through the whole workflow again of, changing this file here, committing it, pushing it up to GitHub, cloning the repo in the Cloud Shell. Instead of doing all that, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to open a code right here in the Cloud Shell. And so there's a stripped down version of the engine that Visual Studio Code uses right here in the Cloud Shell. So notice I'm just opening the template. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new rule. I'm going to add another security rule. And for the sake of catching any errors, I'll just do it here first, and then I'll paste it over there. And this will also be easier to see. So watch, that's one rule, right? This is a collection of security rules. Let me add a comma here, hit enter, then I can just create the next rule. And since I'm so lazy, I'll just copy the other one. Call this one HTTPS and say allow access to port 443. Right, and then priority 101 because the other one was 100. So that's the change that I'm going to make. Let's see here. Missing a closing bracket. There you go. That can be tricky. Did you guys see that? Watch. Let me just delete one curly brace. I was stuck there for a second, right? So that's why I use Visual Studio Code, because you get this little, helper. But even then, sometimes you won't notice that stuff. And that's why inside a CI/CD system, like in a build stage for infrastructure code, it's good to lint the JSON in these templates so you can catch that kind of stuff. Anyways, let me take that code and just paste it over here. So security rules, security rule number 1. Let me just make sure I'm copying the right thing here. Grab this. All right, cool. So just plug that in right here. Cheating a little bit, but you guys get the idea. I'll save that and then close out of that editor. Let's do another deployment. Or arrow back up to this guy right here. Now we're going to do deployment in 002. Okay. Run it and see what happens here. Oh yeah, so this happens sometimes. And this is why it's good to read error messages. I get a lot of people saying, hey, Mike, it didn't work. I'm like, well, did you read the error message? Because look, expired authentication token. I'm in the Cloud Shell. It just randomly did that, even though I was already working on stuff. So let's out of it and reconnect. And, probably putting this on my computer would be the best thing, especially if I was doing stuff every day on this machine. But honestly, this is a machine where I do a lot of recordings, and I don't like to install stuff over and over and over again on the same machine. Anyways, different chat. Let me up arrow back over to the previous command. That's also a neat trick in the Cloud Shell. Notice it maintained my history, even though I restarted the shell. All right, let's try it. Ready? Hit enter. And now it's asking for the app name. This thing's confused. It's looking at the wrong template. So let's do this. I've got a template in the root of that folder, same name. I had to sit there for a second and I realized, wait, that's not the right template. So cd into IAC demo. Yeah, that's the one that we want to do. Up arrow, back over, right? Because we're looking in the local folder. So that's something fun to watch out for. All right, let's run it. Okay, so succeeded, incremental mode, right? So going back over, let me first show you guys this. Let's close out of this, go back into it. So check it out right over here on the top right. This resource group has got 2 deployments in its history. So if we click on this, we can see deployment number 1, see deployment number 2. First one took 11 seconds, second one took 6 because it was an incremental change. It was just one rule on an existing group. So it was a little bit less work to do there. And here's the cool part. A lot of times you're going to find these things are failing on you. And one of the biggest things that we used to have to do when I was at AWS, where we had hundreds of these templates, we literally had to run tests all day, every day. And because otherwise, if you'd let like a week go by, you'd find out that the template broke because something changed on the platform or an image was updated for a VM, you know what I mean? And it was just like constantly breaking. So that's going to be something like if you're going to get serious about infrastructure as code, you're going to have to constantly be testing your templates, not just when you commit your code but to make sure that they still deploy. Like that's a strict requirement if you're going to really depend on this stuff. However, check it out. You can come in here and investigate any failed deployments, and you can drill right in, and you'll be able to see the same deployment screen that you would have seen in a portal. You'll see what the inputs were. We haven't done any of those yet. You'll see the outputs. You'll see the template as it was when you launched it. Okay. A couple other things I'll show you just real quick. Like there's no parameters in this thing, right? There's no customization. So let's say, for example, we wanted to let the operator who launched the template define like the name of the group, right? So we could parameterize this value or any value we wanted to. So here's kind of how it works. Let's add a parameter to the parameters block. Just come in here and then we'll say new parameter. I'm just typing new space parameter. That's a snippet that's available in that ARM tools extension. And then I can just say NSG NSG name, type string, description, name of the NSG. That would be all that we need to do. And right now you can see that it's like, hey, you're not using this anywhere. So we're going to put a squiggle underneath it to warn you. It's just sitting here doing nothing. So let's make sure we are using that. So over here, this is how you would reference a parameter value. It's very simple. It looks intimidating when you don't know what's going on, but it's easy. Watch, I'll delete the name that's in there. And so this is the trick. Inside double quotes and then inside square brackets, now you've got access to template functions that are built in. There's adding, things together. There's concatenating strings. There's all these different functions, right? And then also, if you scroll way down to the bottom, there's one for parameters. So there's a function where you can reference the parameter values. So check it out. That's a function. So put your programmer hat on. When we call a function or a method, what do? Well, we have a method signature, right? So we have parentheses. And then we say, hey, what are we passing to this function? Well, it's going to be NSG name. So this, when the user deploys the template and feeds in a custom security group name, it's going to get passed into this resource. It's going to get read using this parameters function. That allows us to do a runtime, like a dynamic template, right? We deploy the template, we plug in the information, then we're good to go. Also, you might want to launch these interactively. There's a couple of neat tricks for that. So check it out. So number one, this isn't the neat part. Let me show you this anyways. I'll show you something better. Templates, search the portal for templates, right? Or actually look for template, deploy a custom template. So when you come into this screen, if you wanted to, if you're just, messing around, kind of doing what I'm doing, or type in some code and you want to try it out quickly, you could just paste it right in, build your own template in the editor. See how it's all the stuff we were looking at? So you could literally just copy it here. You could also upload it, right? But you just plug it in right there. Click on save. Now it takes you into the deployment screen. And so I can say, hey, let's drop this NSG and IIC demo, and notice the name parameter, right? It's like, hey, what do you want to call the security group? We'll say web -NSG2 or something like that, right? And also notice this. This is cool. See how it actually formatted the display name? So if you're building solutions for other people on your team to use, you can build a really prescriptive template, right? They don't need to really know much about Azure. They just need to know how to fill in these fields. You can even put a description in these little text boxes, these little context menus. But what's cool about this is notice how it's formatted in a readable way, NSG space name. That's because over here in the template, if you kind of use this camel case notation, it'll render the display name like that for you, and this description will show up in the portal. All right, cool. So we can also launch these templates from the command line and pass in these parameter values. We can use a parameters file that answers these parameters. All right, but those are some of the big things that I wanted to show. And then what was the other thing about launching templates graphically? Oh yeah, let me go back over to GitHub. Let me show you one that I got out here, which is dealing with this one earlier this week. Main controller. So check out this repo that I got. This is actually one of the Azure Quick Start templates projects, I guess I should say. Notice that it's got a deploy to Azure button. You may have seen this. You can wire up your own version of this, but it requires that the template be accessible publicly. Here's the idea how this works. Watch this. When I click this button, right, I'm just going to open it in a new tab. It redirects you into the Azure portal, and it's reading in the template, right? It's like pulling in the template. It's rendering all the parameters so the user, the operator, can fill out the fields, click on review and create, and then it goes and does its thing. So all you need to do for this, and you can look at this repo or you can look at the ones in Azure Quick Start. If you look in the README file and you actually look at the raw code, it's literally just an anchor tag in HTML. And if I can zoom in on this, probably not the best visual here, but it's just pointing to portal.azure.com /create/microsoft.template/URI. And then you provide the full path to your template. It's got to be URL encoded, right? But you provide the full path to your template wherever it is, like GitHub or whatever. Now the user has a nice, pretty little button to click on. Did I lose it? Yeah, to click on when they're ready to go off and do that deployment. So that's kind of the idea. So that's cool, right? Let me clone this repo. We'll show you one last thing, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Going a little bit over time here. Let me do this. CD back out to the root of that repos folder. We'll clone this one. I just want to show you what a full-blown template might look like. CD into domain controller. Okay, so one of the cool things with this is, notice there's a DSC folder. So with this template, you're spinning up a VM, all the dependencies, the storage, the network, all that stuff. But then the VM, as it comes up, it's going out and grabbing a bunch of DSC code so it can bootstrap itself. So this one is gnarly. There's tons of code in here, but check out Visual Studio Code on the very bottom left. If you go to ARM template outline, you get this nice little thing that will help you navigate all the resources in this template. And this is an old template. It was written before like managed storage and stuff. So you kind of see some old patterns in here, but it's still an interesting use case because not only do you have all these dependencies for the VM, but watch this. When you drill under the VM and under property, or excuse me, resources for the VM, there is a create AD forest resource. Cool part about this outline thing too is like when you find a resource in here, you just highlight it on the template outline screen, and then it'll basically highlight it in the code. Watch, I click on create AD forest, boom. That's what's highlighted here. So this is pretty slick because this is actually a property of the VM itself, and this is setting up a DSC extension. You might have seen this with virtual machines in the past in Azure, right? Like custom script extension, PowerShell DSC extension, Puppet extension. But all this is telling the machine to do, like once the VM is built, go out to GitHub, grab the DSC code. Notice that the Microsoft.PowerShell extension has a modules URL. And we're just passing in from the parameters, like the location, basically GitHub, right? And this is a good example of them concatenating a bunch of stuff together. See this little function right here? Concatenate. So they're pulling together a couple different input parameters along with the file name to construct the full path to the code that we need. And it's just going out to GitHub, grabbing the DSC code, and then that machine runs those scripts to turn itself. In this case, this one is a domain controller. So if you were to reverse engineer all the code in here, there's a bunch of PowerShell code in there that builds a domain controller, which is pretty cool. A couple other things that are important in here that are common in any infrastructure as code solution. Dependency management, right? Depends on, you see it right here. You see it in a bunch of different places like up here. So here's the virtual machine resource, right? Again, it gets really crazy with just beyond just a few things. But notice the dependency list for this virtual machine. We have a dependency on a storage account, on a NIC. They're going old school with this one and putting the machine into an availability set. So again, this is an older template. They have a load balancer in this one for some reason. So there's a dependency on the load balancer. But anyways, right, you can wire up your own dependency chain. And again, they're using a function here. In this case, it's the resource ID function to just, create the full path for the actual name of the storage account. It's combining some static code, Microsoft.storage/storage account, combining that with a variable that the user would have input when they launched it, right? So anyways, it's really kind of like, in my experience with this stuff, it's very hard to sit back and just absorb all of this and be like, oh, now I know infrastructure is code. It's much better to tackle a project focused, I guess I would say, exercise or lab. Like literally the first time I ever did an infrastructure template, I was just like, well, let me see if I can build one VM. And I stepped through it slowly. And I think probably the biggest thing that I see as a challenge for people in the field is they're frustrated that they don't get to build the template with just like an entire SharePoint farm on day one. And it's just not going to happen, right? Like it's just too verbose. It's too big. You got to take your time to step through it. And here's the thing. Here's the other thing with this. Like you're going to struggle. Like that's not negotiable. Like you get to struggle with this thing. It's the ARM templates. You might struggle with Terraform for a little while. But there will be a cost of entry to learning this stuff. The people that get awesome DevOps jobs, cloud jobs and stuff, they're going to have the skills around this because they put the time in. So I know we're all busy, but I would say like if that's the role you're going after and you're really interested in this stuff, spend some time to work at it slowly. Start small, and maybe don't like ARM. That's not the point of this presentation, right? It's the framework, it's the patterns. One last thing I'll mention. And I'm assuming Microsoft talked about this at Ignite this week. I didn't get a chance to do any Ignite stuff. I'm going to share this article. Chris Peachman, I think that's the way I say his name. He's a big-time Azure MVP. This is a great article. I was just reading this morning. And so this is basically, it shows here ARM template alternative. But it's really an abstraction layer, right, above ARM templates. So it's a way for you to write infrastructure code. Well done, Chris. Well done. It's a way for you to implement infrastructure code using a Terraform-like syntax, right? If you've seen HashiCorp configuration language, the HCL, you're probably looking at these ARM templates and you're like, forget this, right? I'm going to do HCL. Well, Azure Bicep is a way for you to basically write a very similar language and then compile down to ARM templates in JSON. So if you're an Azure person, like if you want to be known like in your environment is like the Azure go-to, like I would totally be getting into this stuff. But Chris does a great job in this article about talking about the basics, and what I would focus on, or at least what I'll show you right now is, he's talking about kind of like some of the stuff I showed you, but then he gets into like, here's how you build your biceps. Anyways, here is like some of the code, right? If you look right here, it's very Terraform-esque, if you will, right? Resource, my storage, whatever you want to call it, then the provider info along with the API version, right? And then inside curly braces, it's just simple key value pairs. So there's no, there's not as much expression or double quotes and curly braces and stuff, right? So it's kind of readable. It's like, okay, name of the storage account is going to be this, location, SKU type for the replication. You know what I mean? Very readable. And I would venture to bet that this is going to be a big deal for Microsoft, right? Because they want to get people using their stuff. So I would check that out. I would embrace this concept. If you haven't got into Git yet, get into that. It's not as bad as it looks. But that is the presentation I know went over, and I'd like to open it up for Q&A at this point. But I don't know if I can hear anybody on this live stream, I guess.
I just added Jeff to the stream, and I do have some questions that I saw. Raymond had a question here.
Okay.
I'll put it on the screen. Go ahead, Jeff.
So from Raymond, what ARM templates are available for cyber security or authentication?
Yeah, so if you're ever interested in like finding what Microsoft has put out, a couple places you could go. Number one, Azure Quick Start templates. This is one place. But if you're interested in, if you're really like thinking about compliance and like things like that, also Blueprints might be the go-to. Okay, so Quick Start, I would search their repository. There's almost 1,000 templates, so it'll give you good inspiration. Let me point this out real quick in the portal. If you go and look for Blueprints, and it's perpetually in preview. I'm not really sure what the story is with that, but blueprints are a way for you to do ARM templates along with Azure policy, along with RBAC role assignments, all that kind of stuff. So when you're looking at blueprint definitions, notice when you go to create a blueprint, you can base it off of all of these other well-done blueprints, right? Things that are FedRAMP compliant, right? HIPAA, ISO 27001, right? So I would reverse engineer some of these maybe if it fits, if the scenario fits. Otherwise, you can look into quick start templates. At the end of the day, though, Microsoft, they're just giving you helper code out here. So there's going to be a lot of times where we have to write stuff ourselves. So it's not always going to be perfect. It's a good question, though. Hopefully that helped a little bit. Anything else there, Jeff?
Let's see. Anyone else have a question? If so, just type that in the chat and I'll relay that. The other thing I'll say is for anyone who hasn't joined Pluralsight for training, I know a lot of people don't always want to pay the subscription price, but Pluralsight has an agreement, an arrangement with Microsoft. So if you Google Pluralsight in Azure and free, you'll find that ability to view, I think, pretty much all of the Azure content on Pluralsight, and you can do that for free without paying for a subscription, which is nice.
Cool. Hey, can I mention one other thing here, Jeff? For you guys that are looking for more free training, go to youtube.com/cloudskills. This is the YouTube channel for my company. If you look at the Azure tutorials, we got a really cool one with Terraform. This is a longer video, about an hour. So if you want to do something from scratch with Terraform and you're like disappointed because I didn't talk about Terraform today, go watch this one because it's the whole hour on Terraform. But there's also Azure automation. There's stuff with Azure pipelines. Tons of stuff in here that falls under the realm of the infrastructure as code conversation. So give it a look. You might like it.
All right, so Phil on here has a question, GitHub Actions for deployments.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Sure, yeah, so let me show you guys that. Let me pull up the browser here. So GitHub, show you guys some samples. This isn't too bad. It's pretty doable in my opinion. I really like what Microsoft's done with GitHub Actions. So this is how I would navigate this. You're thinking about Azure stuff. Find this topic and bookmark it, because you'll notice down here they have a nice link, and they probably put more stuff on here, but all the Azure actions right now are available on this page. And so for anybody that hasn't really dealt with actions, it's kind of like the new Azure pipelines, right? So in Azure DevOps, Microsoft has their pipeline service, right? And so a lot of that same functionality is showing up over here in GitHub Actions. So what you do with GitHub Actions is you write a workflow file in YAML, and it basically just lays out all the steps of what happens when you commit your code, and should we deploy a template? If so, where is it in the repository? Stuff like that. So take a look at this, right? We come into Azure Actions. We're just querying the marketplace. And down here on the right, excuse me, not on the right. I saw this in here yesterday, but I was on a different computer. Saw an action in here yesterday. Let me see next. Yeah, deploy ARM template or Azure Resource Manager template. They also going to have stuff in here for Terraform and everything as well, right? But check it out down here. This would be an example workflow. So again, a workflow would be a YAML file. You put it in the repository with your code. I'll actually show you one that I've got. It's not an ARM template one, but it'll make sense. But notice right here, right? In your workflow, you're like, all right, we need a trigger. So when somebody pushes to the master branch, for example, we're going to have a job, one or more jobs. And in this case, this workflow file is just saying, hey, we're going to do a build and deploy. So this job runs on an Ubuntu machine. So just like Azure Pipelines, GitHub Actions has hosted runners. So when you do these workflows, it could just go grab an Ubuntu machine for you. And then here's the steps. We're just going to run through these steps. It's going to use this first action to check out the code from the master branch. It's going to use the Azure login action to get you authenticated into Azure. And what you would need for this is you would need to build or create a service principal. And then that service principal would need to have permissions to where you want to deploy to. So if it was a subscription or a resource group, you would plug the credentials into your repository. There's a secrets section of each repository. So you just go into that. I'll show you where that is, and you would just plug in your credentials. So that's the first action to get you logged in. Then you do, this job uses the Azure ARM deployment action, right? And then we're going to use that action with this subscription ID. We're going to deploy to this resource group. We're going to grab this template that we checked out from master, you know what I mean? And then if there's any parameters, here it is, right? Key value, admin username, sysadmin, you know what I mean? That kind of stuff. And that's really the idea, right? So it's actually insanely simple to set up. Let me show you. I think I have one already built. I can just kind of show you real quick a repo that's set up for this. Was it this one? No. Give me 1 second, and I'll wrap this up. Let's see. Yeah, here's one. So here's a repo. This is actually a .NET application, but look, in this folder right here, .github/workflows. So if you were doing a workflow in GitHub Actions just to deploy your ARM templates or whatever, you would just create a repo, just like I did at the beginning of this talk. And in the subfolder .github/workflows, you would create like a main.yaml. And this is a workflow file that I was using to deploy ASP.NET Core. All right, and so a little bit more involved here, right? Because it's like compiling the app and all this kind of stuff, but same concept. You can see at the very end, once it gets the app all set up and stuff, it just uses the web apps deploy action and then just pushes the application to app service. So, you know, like I was just showing on the previous screen, you can have a very simple workflow in a folder like that. And then all you would need to do is in your repo, come over to settings. You would go over to secrets, and then you would create a new secret that you could reference. That's what I was just talking about. So you're not going to see anything in here, but you know, when you build your service principal, you can just plug in the JSON from that right over here. And if you walk through all the stuff that is in Microsoft's documentation, so let me go back. If you follow the getting started stuff on this page, you can totally figure it out. It's very well documented. So that's how I would navigate that, deploying an ARM template and GitHub Actions. Hopefully those things helped. I got a YouTube video where I do all of that with not an ARM template. I do it with ASP.NET Core web application. So this guy right here, deploying to Azure App Service with GitHub Actions. I walk you through building that entire thing from scratch if you want to watch that one.
Awesome, Mike. I have Raymond with me here wanting to ask a question. Here we go.
Okay.
Hey, Mike. I guess the question I mainly had was, you talked about dependency injection in Azure Cloud. I was just wondering, does Microsoft or the .NET pretty much use the same DI framework? Because I've used it kind of before in ASP.NET Core, but I'm not entirely too sure if there's a difference between that and the one in Cloud Shell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let me break that down real quick. So what I was talking about, but I'll answer your question, but there's a little bit of a difference. So what I was talking about in the template itself, like this dependency, like this depends on, that's different than dependency injection. Because what I'm doing is, what I'm saying in the template is, hey, before I build this VM, there's another thing in this template that needs to be done first. So what I'm saying here is, hey, do the storage first, then do the VM. But to answer your question, .NET Core does have dependency injection built in, right? So, you know, if you're that, honestly, that's the road I would go down. I mean, if you want to get into like dependency injection or IOC containers or doing anything outside of that, it's going to be a whole thing. And then there's full Pluralsight courses about it. So yeah, it's it could be pretty heavy. It's definitely an advanced developer topic. And so I would encourage you to kind of, you know, look at .NET Core and see what you like and don't like about it, and then decide, you know, do you want to maybe explore using some other solution for dependency injection. But if you're just getting started with programming, I would kind of like just ease your way into it, because that's going to be a big point of confusion probably if you're newer to the software development space.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
.NET Core. I've done some basic like tutorials on the docs, and it's pretty useful just for creating a simple CRUD website. But
Right.
yeah, just yeah, definitely don't understand dependency injection as much as I should, and especially like the configure services and stuff like that.
It's
But
totally confusing, and it honestly it seems like a lot of that stuff changes from one version to the next, and so there's been some criticism from the community to like make it less frantic because it's a little scattered right now. So yeah, man, like .NET Core is awesome, but it also, your success is predicated probably a little bit on previous experience. So, you know, if you weren't working on .NET, you can still get there, but there's going to be, you know, some nuances you'll have to learn about that you might not run into in other languages. There's a lot of baggage in .NET, like some of it in a good way, some of it in a weird way. I'm a huge fan of it, so I'm not, you know, disparaging, but it's probably not the easiest first place to go as a developer, in my opinion.
gotcha. And the last super quick question I have: when you pass that parameter into, I guess, the app name, doing stuff like that, does it add a lot of overhead whenever you're creating the, I guess, the code for the infrastructure? Wouldn't it be, or does it really not matter?
In this world, it's not a big deal because usually we're not doing stuff that's like close to the hardware in terms of, you know, like we're running some kind of embedded OS or like this thing that has to like respond in 1/10 of a millisecond or whatever, you know what I mean? So in infrastructure code conversation, we're always waiting around for infrastructure to build. That's probably one of the biggest downsides on infrastructure development versus software development. Because for you as a software developer, you can write code, you can hit compile and kind of know right away, oh, this works or it doesn't. Sometimes with infrastructure code, we don't even know until a test is running or a deployment has been in progress for like a half hour if we missed you know, a semicolon somewhere or something stupid. So yeah, we're a little bit more tolerant to those kind of delays in the infrastructure as code world, I would say.
Okay,
So,
cool.
no big deal
Thank
there.
you.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions before we close out? If not, I appreciate, Mike, your time. Great talk. This will be, this was recorded, so we'll make sure that we get a URL to the recording out to everyone. We'll also post it on LinkedIn and on our meetup. I gave the link if anyone wants to join our Tampa Bay Azure user group. As I said, we have events every month. So on behalf of IO Associates, Mike and myself, appreciate you coming out and educating yourselves. Always great to improve our skills and our knowledge of the cloud, and have everyone, hope you have a great night. Thanks so much. See you guys.
Thanks, everybody.